Hi there, I'm Taryn. My family used to call me a disappointment behind closed doors, but the night they named me a disgrace in front of everyone was the night everything changed. I married a man they said wasn't good enough, and they never forgave me for choosing love over status. But was it really just about pride? Or was there something deeper they'd been hiding all along? Have you ever been made to feel like a stranger in your own family? Let me know in the comments. I'm listening. The house in Littleton was buzzing louder than the cicadas outside. Laughter spilled from the sprawling patio, champagne glasses clinked under fairy lights, and the scent of grilling steak floated thick in the summer air. They had dressed it up to look effortless, as they always did. It was another grand reunion, another night to parade the Fletcher name like it meant something more than just the blood in our veins. I arrived later than I should have. Not because I wanted to, but because standing there, alone on the manicured lawn, already made me feel like an outsider. I smoothed down my simple navy dress, adjusted the sleeves nervously. Maybe tonight would be different, I told myself. Maybe they'd see me, really see me, not just the mistakes they thought I embodied. Douglas Fletcher raised his glass near the main table, commanding everyone's attention with the ease of a seasoned politician. Evelyn stood beside him, smiling like a showroom mannequin. I shifted closer to hear over the murmurs. "We are so proud of our daughter, Brielle," Douglas announced, his voice carrying over the music. "Top of her class, already making waves in corporate law. She represents the very best of our family." Polite clapping followed. I clapped too, even though the sound stuck in my throat. "And then there's Taryn," he continued, turning slightly to glance at me. A glance so sharp it could have sliced me in two. "Who decided to follow her own path, married a welder." A chuckle spread among a few of the relatives. "Sometimes you raise a rose and sometimes a weed grows." Laughter now, real and cutting. "And unfortunately," Douglas said, lifting his glass higher, "even weeds carry our name." The words didn't hit all at once. They settled slowly, like dust after a building collapses. Evelyn said nothing. Brielle smirked, tilting her champagne flute toward me in mock salute. I stood there frozen, cheeks burning, hands twisting the hem of my dress until my knuckles ached. No one defended me. No one even pretended to be embarrassed. I forced my legs to move, muttering some excuse about fresh air. I stumbled toward the side garden, where the party lights faded into shadows, and the music sounded like it came from another world. The hydrangeas were in full bloom. They smelled like home and foreign soil all at once. I leaned against the old oak tree, pressing my forehead against the rough bark, willing the tears not to fall. Around me, memories unfurled like old photographs. Every small slight, every cold shoulder, every pointed absence suddenly too vivid to ignore. When Griffin found me 20 minutes later, the grass was wet under my heels, and the cicadas had gone quiet. He didn't ask what happened. One look at my face must have told him enough. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around me. My body sagged into his, trembling but silent. No tears, not anymore. I had already cried for them too many times. That night, under the flickering light of my bathroom mirror, I wiped off my makeup with trembling fingers. As the dark smudges faded, so did the last pieces of hope I had carried. I stared into my own reflection, at the girl who had been told she was less than nothing, and I made a promise. The next time they tried to erase me, I wouldn't just stand there. The Fletcher Family Charity Gala shimmered under 1,000 tiny lights, a perfect portrait staged for the town of Littleton to admire. I stepped through the grand entryway, my heels clicking softly against polished marble, every inch of the place screaming curated elegance. I shouldn't have come. I knew that in my gut. But part of me, maybe the part still clinging to the idea that I could belong, hoped for something different tonight. Maybe a nod, a smile, a place at the table. I checked the seating chart posted at the entrance. My name, Taryn Fletcher, tucked away on the last table by the kitchen doors. I stared at it for a full minute, willing it to change. It didn't. Making my way to my seat, I passed clusters of relatives laughing, sharing stories, glasses clinking in celebration. No one looked my way. No one paused their conversations. I was invisible, a ghost floating through a house that used to feel like home. During the group photo session, I found myself guided to the very edge of the crowd. One of the organizers smiled politely and motioned for me to step just a little further back, as if I might ruin the symmetry if I stood too close to the golden center. Brielle, radiant and composed, flanked by our parents who beamed with pride. I tilted my chin up, forcing a smile for the camera, heart sinking lower with each flash. They weren't just ignoring me anymore. They were rearranging the story without me. Later that night, back in my apartment, I scrolled through the freshly uploaded gallery of photos from the gala. There they were, my family, gleaming under chandeliers, surrounded by friends, wrapped in the glow of collective admiration. And there I wasn't. In every carefully selected photo, I had been cropped out. Where I knew I had stood, there was now a convenient gap, a vase, a sliver of wallpaper, as if I had never been there at all. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the laptop. I hadn't realized how much a picture could hurt until I wasn't in one. Sitting alone at my small kitchen table, I stared at the empty teacup in front of me, the steam long gone, the warmth a distant memory. It wasn't the public disgrace that shattered me. It was the deliberate, silent erasure. It was their quiet rewriting of the story to pretend I had never mattered. I thought about all the birthdays where my name was an afterthought on the cake, the holidays where gifts for me were clearly last-minute afterthoughts, the family trips where I somehow always ended up taking the pictures instead of being in them. It wasn't an accident. It was a system, a design. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there feeling the slow burn start to spread through my chest. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was awake. I thought silence was safer than confrontation. I was wrong. The venue in Denver sparkled under a cloudless sky, banners congratulating Brielle fluttering in the breeze. The entrance was framed by white lilies, and the champagne flowed like rivers inside the grand hall. Everyone looked picture-perfect, dressed in tailored suits and glittering dresses. I stepped through the door in my plain navy dress again, the same one from the reunion. It had felt safe then. Now it felt embarrassingly small. I lingered near the edge of the crowd, plastering on a smile when anyone glanced my way. Most didn't. I caught glimpses of my parents greeting guests like dignitaries at a gala. Brielle, radiant in white and gold, floated from group to group, accepting compliments like royalty. I moved to approach Evelyn, heart pounding, but she barely acknowledged me with a tight smile before pulling me aside. "We're short on staff," she said smoothly, placing a tray of flutes into my hands. "Just for a little while. Help the servers keep up, will you?" I stood there stunned, holding the tray like a fool. Before I could find words, she was gone, her heels clicking away toward the photographers. Guests mistook me for catering. I could see it in the way they snapped their fingers politely, ordered drinks, asked about hors d'oeuvres. My face burned. Every time I tried to step away, another glass was thrust into my hands. My own family didn't intervene. They didn't even seem to notice. The humiliation sat heavy in my chest, a stone I couldn't swallow. But I said nothing. Not yet. I told myself it was Brielle's day. I told myself not to ruin it. When the time came for the speeches, I slipped into a corner, clutching a water glass just to have something to do with my hands. Douglas took the microphone, his voice booming through the hall. He praised Brielle's hard work, her ambition, her achievements. How proud he was to call her his daughter. His eyes glistened with emotion. Someone, maybe one of Evelyn's friends, called out, laughing, "And what about your other daughter?" Douglas hesitated. A brief flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he recovered with a tight smile. Evelyn answered instead, her voice loud enough for half the hall to hear. "She's finding her own way. We're just proud of Brielle today." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The kind of laughter that isn't cruel outright, but cuts even deeper because of its casual dismissal. I stood there, frozen, feeling every word like a pin pressed into my skin. I wasn't just an afterthought. I was an embarrassment, a blemish on their otherwise pristine portrait. The room blurred, the polished floors, the glittering lights, the carefully arranged flower displays. All of it twisted into a distorted, mocking dream. I didn't remember setting the glass down. I didn't remember pushing through the crowd. I just knew that one moment, I was inside, drowning in shame, and the next, I was outside under the gray wash of the evening sky, gasping for air like someone had kicked me in the chest. I walked aimlessly toward the parking lot, shoes crunching on gravel. My mind replayed every word, every smirk, every sidelong glance I had collected like bruises over the years. This wasn't new. It had just gotten louder. Standing there under the dim orange glow of the parking lot lights, I realized something. Maybe they had already chosen the life they wanted. Maybe it was time I chose mine too. The Fletcher family dining room was bathed in warm light. The heavy mahogany table set with their finest china. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the polished floor. It all looked so inviting at first glance. Normal, safe. I should have known better. They had called it a small dinner. Just family, Evelyn had said on the phone, her voice syrupy sweet, too smooth to trust. After the last few months, after everything, a part of me still wanted to believe it was a step toward healing. A gesture maybe, a reaching out. I sat stiffly between my parents, facing Brielle, who was scrolling absently through her phone. The air was too still, too careful, and I could feel it pressing against my skin. We made it through salad, and halfway through the main course, before Douglas cleared his throat in that deliberate way he had when he was about to deliver a sermon. He set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Taryn," he said, voice calm but carrying, "your mother and I have been thinking about your future, about helping you get back on a better path." I set my knife down slowly. Every cell in my body went cold. "There's someone we'd like you to meet," he continued. "Connor Hathaway. He's a good man, comes from a respectable family, doing very well for himself, the kind of man who can offer you the life you deserve." There it was, not an invitation, a directive. I looked at Evelyn. She smiled encouragingly, as if this was a gift I should be grateful for. Brielle didn't even look up. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What was there to say? It wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation. The next few days blurred together in a haze of resentment and numbness. Against every screaming instinct, I agreed to attend the casual gathering they insisted on. Maybe, a small voice reasoned, refusing outright would only deepen the wedge, give them more ammunition. When I arrived, it took exactly 3 minutes to realize it wasn't a gathering at all. It was a setup. Connor Hathaway was already there, seated comfortably in the living room, holding a glass of scotch like he owned the place. He stood when he saw me, a practiced smile sliding across his face. "Taryn," he said, reaching for my hand, "I've heard so much about you." The room spun slightly. I took his hand because it felt easier than making a scene. They left us alone, of course. Just long enough for him to lean in and say, low and amused, "Don't worry, I'm used to arranged situations." The evening dragged. Connor talked about his career, his future plans, his idea of a wife's role. At no point did he ask about mine. It was clear. I was being slotted into a life already designed, a life with no room for the pieces of myself I had fought so hard to hold on to. I smiled. I nodded. I played the part. Inside, something began to crack open, a raw, angry thing that had been hibernating until now. When I finally made my excuses and left, the cool night air hit me like a slap. I walked aimlessly down the sidewalk, past the manicured hedges and identical houses of my childhood neighborhood. They didn't want me happy. They wanted me compliant. Maybe they had already chosen the life they wanted. Maybe it was time I chose mine, too. The air inside the Fletcher dining room was colder than the December wind rattling the windows. Griffin stood beside me, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, looking both too big and too genuine for the polished formality of the room. I had brought him because they had asked. No, demanded. They wanted to see what kind of life I was building, as if they were evaluating an investment. I hadn't expected a warm welcome, but the silence that greeted us felt sharp enough to draw blood. We sat down at the long table, a gleaming beast that had hosted countless perfect dinners, countless photo-ready moments. Plates clinked, forks scratched. No one asked Griffin about his journey. No one even offered him a drink. Douglas, never one for patience, leaned forward after the first course, clasping his hands together with a performative smile. "So, Griffin," he said, voice heavy with expectation, "tell us about your future plans, your prospects." Griffin answered evenly, speaking about his welding work, the contracts he was building, the certification courses he was taking at night. His voice carried the quiet pride of someone who had earned everything he owned. Douglas nodded, the way a professor might nod at a particularly disappointing student. "And your income?" he asked casually, voice smooth. "Ballpark figure, just so we understand." The table went very still. Griffin's jaw tightened, but he answered. A modest number, but honest. Honest enough to make Brielle snicker behind her wine glass, to make Evelyn press her lips together in a way that wasn't quite a smile. The humiliation poured over me like ice water. It wasn't about money. It was about measuring worth and finding me wanting by association. Douglas chuckled under his breath. "Well, not everyone needs a six-figure salary to be happy, I suppose." I stared at the linen napkin in my lap, my hands shaking with a fury I could barely contain. They weren't just insulting him. They were insulting me, my choices, my life. Dinner continued, brittle and hollow. Every bite of food tasted like ash. Afterward, as the dishes were being cleared, I asked my parents for a moment alone. We stepped into the study, a room full of trophies and certificates, silent witnesses to the expectations that had ruled my childhood. I turned to face them, heart pounding. My voice when it came was calm, clear. "If you can't respect my life," I said, looking from one stony face to the other, "you won't be part of it." Evelyn gasped softly, like I'd said something obscene. Douglas just stared at me, as if I were some problem he had failed to solve. I didn't wait for their response. I turned and walked out, Griffin falling into step beside me without a word. I thought drawing a line would be enough. I didn't realize they'd be the first ones to set it on fire. The first whisper of betrayal came not from my parents, not even from Brielle, but from a distant cousin's social media post. A casual picture of the wedding invitations, all gold leaf and ivory paper, fanned across her kitchen table like a hand of winning cards. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, willing my name to appear. It didn't. I checked the mailbox twice that week, convincing myself I must have missed it somehow. I even scrolled through my junk emails at 2 a.m, searching for something, anything that said I was still considered part of their world. There was nothing. The truth settled into my bones with the slow, cold certainty of winter frost. Out of stubborn hope, I called Evelyn. She answered on the third ring, voice perfectly even, almost bored. "Oh, sweetheart, you weren't invited," she said, as if we were discussing the weather. "It's a small, intimate event, very close family only." I gripped the phone tighter, the edge of the counter digging into my hip. "And Griffin," she added smoothly, "wouldn't have been appropriate, even if you had come." There it was. Not just exclusion, but an erasure. Griffin and I didn't fit the image they wanted to present. We never had. I hung up without another word, not angrily, just finished. That night I sat in the living room, Griffin quietly fixing a loose hinge on the front door. I watched him work, steady hands, brow furrowed in focus. A man who showed up, who built things with patience and care. The opposite of everything my family valued. I realized something profound as I watched him. They didn't just exclude me because of who Griffin was. They excluded me because, standing beside him, I reminded them of everything they couldn't control. I wasn't sad. Not exactly. The sadness had hollowed out long ago. What I felt now was quieter, heavier, a final closing of a door I hadn't realized was still open. Instead of wallowing, Griffin and I packed an overnight bag. We drove west toward the mountains, the road unwinding before us like a second chance. We rented a tiny cabin tucked among the pines, a place where the air smelled of sap and rain, and the stars burned cold and sharp overhead. We cooked over a fire, drank cheap wine out of coffee mugs, and let the silence between us speak the words we didn't need to say. Choosing joy wasn't easy. It didn't erase the ache, but it reminded me that my life was mine to fill, and I was done letting them carve pieces out of it. Lying in the narrow bed that night, Griffin's heartbeat steady against my back, I stared into the darkness and smiled. Sometimes you don't burn bridges. Sometimes they hand you the matches. It started with whispers at the office, small, sharp-edged murmurs floating across the break room while I poured myself a coffee. I caught my name once, not in accusation but in pity, the way you might glance at someone standing too close to the edge of a cliff. I didn't have to ask. The news found me before lunch. Douglas Fletcher, once the university's shining example of integrity and prestige, was now under investigation for misconduct. The headline blared across every local station. Respected professor, alleged scandal, pending inquiries. I stood frozen by the television mounted in the corner of the diner, where I picked up shifts on weekends. The video showed the front steps of the university, reporters crowding for sound bites. Douglas kept his head down, Evelyn trailing behind him with tight lips and a tighter grip on her purse. The carefully polished image of the Fletcher family cracked and crumbled in real time. No press releases could patch it. No smiling photo ops could erase the suspicion now etched across the faces of their former friends. I thought it would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like standing in the middle of a house fire you didn't start, knowing you were the only one who wouldn't pretend the smoke wasn't choking everyone. Later that night, my phone rang. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Some part of me, a naive, battered piece, still hoped the call would be different. An apology, an admission, it wasn't. Douglas's voice was clipped, controlled, the same tone he used to scold students for late assignments. "You never understood what you cost us," he said without preamble. "Your rebellion made us weak, made them think we weren't worthy of respect." I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, fingers tightening around the phone. "You chose to shame us," he continued. "You brought this on the family." Evelyn's voice murmured in the background, soft and affirming, the way she had always stood behind him, silent and complicit. The accusations weren't new, but hearing them now, weaponized as their world burned down around them, stripped away whatever brittle strings had remained between us. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I listened. I absorbed the poison for one last time. And then I said quietly, "I hope someday you find a version of this story you can live with." I ended the call. There was no satisfaction, no slam of the phone, no final dramatic word, just a silence so pure it felt almost holy. If they wanted a villain, maybe it was time I stopped apologizing for not being their hero. The knock came just after sunset, when the last slant of light stretched long across our modest living room. Griffin was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. I froze halfway to the door, the old familiar dread curling low in my stomach. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know it was them. Douglas and Evelyn stood on the porch, their coats too thin for the early spring chill, their faces drawn and hollow. For a moment, I stayed behind the door, hand resting lightly on the knob, breathing through the wave of conflict rising inside me. Then I opened it. Douglas cleared his throat, the sound rough and rehearsed. "Taryn, your mother and I thought maybe it was time." Evelyn stepped forward, clutching her purse to her chest like a lifeline. "We've had a rough few months," she said, voice cracking on the word rough. "Things didn't turn out the way we expected." I nodded, waiting. "We thought," Douglas continued, each word dragging like an anchor, "maybe we could stay here, just until we figure things out." It wasn't an apology. It was survival dressed up as reconciliation. I leaned against the doorframe, letting their words wash over me without sinking in. Family duty. That's what Evelyn said next. As if the past could be rewritten by those two syllables alone. As if the years of cutting me out, erasing me from their lives, could be patched over with a desperate plea now that their world had crumbled. Griffin appeared behind me, silent, steady, the heat of him a quiet anchor at my back. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. His presence alone reminded me who I had become. I thought about the endless nights I spent wondering what I had done wrong, about the hollow ache that grew every time they chose pride over love, about the way they only ever reached for me when they needed something. If I let them in, I wouldn't be saving them. I would be erasing myself all over again. "No," I said quietly. Douglas's face darkened, the old anger flaring up like a storm rekindled. "You owe us," he barked. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She clutched at my hand, but I pulled it gently away. "I don't owe you anything," I said, my voice steady, my heart strangely calm. "You made your choices. I made mine." The silence between us stretched, taut and final. Without waiting for more pleas or threats, I stepped back inside and closed the door. I leaned against the wood for a moment, breathing in the heavy, clean stillness. I didn't just close the door behind them. I locked it, and this time, I swallowed the key. The letter wasn't long. Just a few carefully chosen words inked onto thick stationery, my handwriting steady despite the ache humming low in my chest. I folded the page once, twice, tucking it neatly into the envelope alongside the family album I hadn't opened in months. It felt heavier than it should have, that album. Not because of its leather binding or the sheer number of photos, but because of everything it represented. The years I spent trying to fit into frames that were never built to hold me. At the post office, I hesitated with my hand over the slot. A part of me, stubborn and battered, still whispered that maybe I should keep it. Maybe someday they'd change. Maybe someday it would mean something different. But I knew better now. I let the envelope slip from my fingers, listening as it disappeared into the hollow chute with a soft, final thud. Walking back to my car, the mountain air was sharp and clean in my lungs, clearing out the dust of old hopes. It didn't erase the hurt. It didn't stitch the old wounds closed. But it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in years. At home, I found Griffin on the front porch, hammer in hand, fixing the loose railing that had been wobbling since the first snowfall. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, offering a small, knowing smile. He didn't ask where I'd been. He didn't need to. Some things didn't have to be said aloud. I watched him for a moment, letting the simple steadiness of his presence anchor me. This life we were quietly building day by ordinary day, was worth protecting, worth choosing. Sitting on the steps, I let my mind drift back to all the versions of myself I had been. The girl desperate for their approval, the woman hollowed out by their absence, the fighter too tired to keep throwing punches at ghosts. I didn't hate them. Not anymore. I didn't love them the way I used to either. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about letting them back in. It was about letting myself go. Some bridges you burn, others you simply choose never to cross again. Griffin finished hammering the last nail and dusted off his hands. Without a word, he disappeared into the house and returned with 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to me. No speeches, no grand gestures, just presence. The future isn't a road waiting ahead. It's the one we quietly lay brick by brick behind us. Griffin handed me a fresh cup of coffee without saying a word, and somehow it said everything. Looking back, I realize healing isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or applause. It comes quietly, through the simple decisions we make every day to choose peace over chaos, to choose ourselves over the expectations of others. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that family isn't defined by blood, but by respect, by kindness, and by the freedom to be who you are without apology. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to choose your own happiness over family expectations? How did you find the strength to do it? I'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about your own journey, please leave a 1 inch in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. And if you didn't resonate with it, I'd love to hear why too. Your perspective matters. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories like this one. Thank you for being here. You are never alone on your journey forward.